Hey guys, so welcome back to the channel. Today what I'm going to be talking about is Amtrak. It's an often hated organization that runs the United States Intercity Rail. It's kind of similar to Via Rail in Canada. Now I do need to specify, Canada has really poor intercity rail. And so what I'm about to say, you need to take it into context that I don't think Canada is much better in any regard. In fact, Canada has worse intercity rail than the United States on pretty much every level. I think it's time that we kind of discuss why. So in this video, the plan is to discuss high-speed rail, what Amtrak's doing wrong and how they can fix it. And of course, what other countries are doing. If you're not already, consider subscribing to the channel and supporting us on Patreon to help us make more videos just like this. If you look at any relatively successful country today, you'll notice something. They're all building high-speed rail. And it's something that gets brought up in the US media all the time. Why does the United States have so little high-speed rail? In fact, arguably the United States has zero high-speed rail. Why is that? Because true high-speed rail is pretty much at a minimum 180 miles per hour. And it's actually the case that nowhere in the United States do trains currently go that fast in regular service. However, in other countries like Germany, France, Japan, Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, China, and the UK, trains do go this fast on a regular basis, and many of these countries have large networks of high-speed rail. So of course the immediate assumption is that the United States needs to go and build a gigantic high-speed rail network to connect the whole country, right? Well, I definitely don't think that's the case. In fact, I think China's decision to build a massive high-speed rail network completely covering every inch of the country is something that's less practical and more of a political decision. That being said, there's definitely huge benefits to having high-speed rail all over the place. I just don't think it's necessarily what needs to happen in the United States. If you look at the US, there's a couple successful rail corridors. The thing you'll notice about most of them is that trains really don't go that fast, such as in Southern California, Oregon, and Washington, as well as the Northeast. That being said, a lot of these routes don't go that fast as it is. So the question I'd ask is high-speed rail necessary to get more people onto trains in new areas? Probably not, but higher speeds are definitely going to be beneficial. The Northeast Corridor is the only area of the United States that could arguably have high-speed rail. The Nexa Express, which is Amtrak's, again, high-speed train, travels at up to 160 miles per hour in sections of the Nexa Express. However, the trip between Boston and Washington, D.C. is still very long and painful. The truth is, if the United States wants to take the approach of upgrading an existing line, that being the Northeast Corridor, to use high-speed level trains, well, we're taking the totally wrong approach. As I mentioned, when other countries implemented high-speed rail, they largely did it on brand new lines that cut straight across areas with giant trenches and bridges and tunnels. That's not really the case with the Northeast Corridor. The Northeast Corridor kind of cuts and winds all the way from Boston down to New York and then takes a relatively straight path from New York to Washington, D.C. As I mentioned, trains still only hit a maximum of 160 miles per hour. And what's more important to mention is that the Nexa Express isn't even Amtrak's most successful operation. The most successful operation is the Northeast Regional, which only maxes out at 125 miles per hour. When we're talking about high-speed rail, I like to think of it in tiers. You have regular speed rail, which is anything under 125 miles per hour. Once you hit 125 miles per hour, you're where the UK and Europe and other countries were back in the 70s and 80s. It's unfortunate, but those speeds are still really fast. That generally in the high-speed rail corridors we're thinking about in North America, we're talking about competing with cars on a highway. But lots of people take long drives. Now, competing with long drives at 125 miles per hour is totally doable. The reality is that highway speeds are around 60 miles per hour, so if you can go 125, you're far better than cars already. This brings us to the next issue we see. It's that Amtrak cares way more about aesthetics and how things look rather than actually building a functional network. If you look at the new Nexa trains that Amtrak recently ordered, they have a maximum speed of 200 miles per hour, which is far more than any of the Northeast Corridor can currently handle. And as I mentioned, the reality of the corridor is that since it's so windy and so indirect in areas, that top speed will just never be reachable without building brand new tracks, which is incredibly expensive and honestly probably unlikely to happen in the current political climate in the United States. With that said, Amtrak would have been much better off ordering trains that max out at, say, 160 miles per hour like their current trains do, and then optimizing sections of the track to get more sections up to around 160 miles per hour. The reality is that sections with a lot of curves just will never be able to go that high. And so buying trains that can go up to 200 miles per hour isn't super useful if you can only use them in a couple short sections of track. The overall travel time will be slightly shorter, but you end up not saving that much per every trip. And as I mentioned, since the Northeast Regional, which actually carries around 10 times more people than the Acela Express, only maxes out at 125 miles per hour, what makes a lot more sense than upgrading tons of track to 200 miles per hour, like many rail fans would like, is to upgrade a lot more track to 125 miles per hour. That means that the rising tide lifts all boats and improves the performance on both the Acela and the more important Northeast Regional route. Now, people often point out other high-speed rail projects in the United States, and I want to address a few of them. You have Texas Central in Texas, which plans to use Japanese-style trains between Houston and Dallas. The issue I see with Texas Central, beyond the fact that it may be blocked completely by complaints from landowners, is the fact that it basically doesn't understand the American context. While the train will be really great for getting you between two stations in Houston and Dallas, it doesn't seem to really acknowledge the fact that Houston and Dallas are giant sprawly cities with frankly terrible transit. The reality is, once you get to one of those terminus stations on the high-speed rail, you're going to have to end up getting in a car a lot of the time, and that pretty much negates a lot of the benefits of high-speed rail. What would look a lot better in Dallas and Houston would be kind of a moderately high-speed rail, something like the Northeast Regional. It would be a lot less expensive to construct. You could make a lot of different decisions that would bring the cost down, and then you could add more stations, and those stations could bring people closer to where they need to go. They may need to drive still, but they would drive less, and that's really the point of high-speed rail in the United States. A good example of this would be Florida's Brightline. While it's not a success in all measures, they're doing a lot of things right. They have quite a few stations, they're focusing on local development and accessibility to bring communities to the train so that they ride it, so that the train itself is successful. They're also extending the line to other locations. Currently, the line travels from Miami all the way up to Fort Lauderdale. But planned stations include Orlando, Disney World, as well as infill stations such as at Boca Raton. The thing about Brightline I like is that it acknowledges the context of where it's operating. In the United States, it's just difficult to push through brand new expensive high-speed lines. What's a lot more pragmatic is to upgrade existing lines and start getting people riding trains. Once you have the ridership, it's a lot easier to make an argument for building a new line or electrifying or doing things like that. Trying to push through a line all at once doesn't make a ton of sense, and it doesn't give people time to adapt to a new form of mobility. Now, back to the Northeast Corridor. The facts are that the Northeast Corridor doesn't suffer from a lot of the issues that these other two corridors suffer from. New York and Washington, D.C. and Boston and Philadelphia all have quite good transit networks that operate 24 hours a day in large part. But still, a lot of mistakes have been made. Those new trains I mentioned, they're actually locomotive hauled instead of EMUs. Now, EMUs aren't 100% of high-speed trains, but many countries like Japan do use them in large part. The reason you would use EMUs is because since they have powered axles, i.e. almost every axle of the train is powered, or at least you have power along the entire length of the train, it's like the difference between rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive in a car, but then amplified by the number of wheels in a train. The reality is that locomotive-hauled trains just take longer to accelerate and decelerate. They work pretty well in places like France, where new high-speed lines meant straight lines and long distances where you could accelerate, and long distances where you could go at high speeds. But on the Northeast Corridor, they really don't make a lot of sense because, as I mentioned, a lot of these curvy sections with tons of corners, the trains have to slow down anyways. Choosing locomotive hauled versus EMU trains means that trains can't accelerate as they leave curves as quickly. That means that you're overall seeing less travel time benefits using the new trains, but Amtrak chose them likely because they wanted to be fancy and have the best high-speed trains. Another thing that really hurts Amtrak is the kind of trains themselves. I do think that having nice new trains makes a lot of sense, as we're seeing with the Acela, but they have to be pragmatic. Buying trains that went a little slower and then just getting more would have made a lot more sense. Another interesting option would be to get trains that only max at 160 miles per hour, but which are dual power. Having dual power trains would be a big asset, because what it could mean is that trains don't have to necessarily go on only the Northeast Corridor. Imagine a train from Albany traveling down to Penn Station and then traveling onto the Northeast Corridor to continue south to Washington. Or trains traveling south from Washington, D.C. a little bit further and covering more people. This kind of idea brings more people into the reach of the Northeast Corridor while still providing fast service. And trains are an issue for Amtrak. You see, if you actually look at the trains as on the Northeast Regional, they're ancient for the large part. And while it is good to see Amtrak investing in new locomotives, the unfortunate thing is that the locomotive can be as new as you want, but if the cars themselves are really old and janky, no one really wants to ride on that. What's even worse is that Amtrak often makes its trains out of a weird mix of different ancient rail cars, and it just doesn't look good. It doesn't give people the impression that the system is modern and fast and up with the times, even if it does have things like Wi-Fi. Now, you might not think aesthetics are that important, but this is an image-based time that we live in. People post pictures on Instagram, people post videos on YouTube like myself, and when you see a train that looks like it came out of the 1920s, well, it doesn't make you really excited. If you look at cars, there's a new car every year that people can go and drive, and if trains can't keep up to the kind of modern amenities that people want, well, they're not as attracted to them. What I'm saying in this is that Amtrak needs to take a different approach. It's clear that the federal government in the United States isn't interested in building brand new high-speed rail lines as much as many of us would like that. So what Amtrak needs to do is take its existing assets and use them far better. You have a lot of great corridor between New York and DC and other areas. Why not serve more trains on it? Why not try to upgrade the sections where the trains are the slowest rather than instead of increasing the speed in a few key sections a couple miles per hour at a time so that you can say you have high-speed rail? Things like this are important for Amtrak to think about, and they're important for us to think about in Canada as well. The thing about North America is that we kind of live in a bubble, so if the United States gets better passenger rail, it's only a certain amount of time before Canada decides to implement those changes and get it as well. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to see more content on Amtrak, New York, other US systems, make sure to leave a comment down below. And as always, have a nice night.